Okay, so pleasure. It just seems like one of those things that's just so basic to being human. That feeling of enjoyment. I mean, we all kind of just we get it, right? But if you're like our listeners, someone with a philosophical mind, you realize that even these simple things can get really complicated and interesting when you really look closely at them.
Oh, absolutely. What seems straightforward at first glance can quickly turn into a whole bunch of really, really profound questions, and that's what makes this, a deep dive into pleasure so fascinating
Yeah.
from a philosophical point of view.
And for our deep dive today, we're looking at the pleasure entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. This is a seriously comprehensive and authoritative resource, and it does a great job of laying out all the different philosophical views on this topic.
Yeah, it's really an invaluable guide. And what we're going to try and do today is navigate through this intellectual landscape. We're going to look at all the different ways philosophers have thought about pleasure. Its nature, its relationship to our ideas about what's good, how it connects to our motivations. And really, really importantly, we're going to look at the inherent challenges in even defining what pleasure is. Think of it as a kind of like a structured exploration. We're going to break it down, make sure you really understand the key debates and the nuances for our philosophically inclined audience.
Okay, so let's start with what seems like the most basic view, the what they call the simple picture. This is the idea that pleasure is basically just one simple feeling. And that feeling makes experiences good and makes us want to have those experiences
Yeah.
and makes us want to do those things that give us that feeling.
Right. That's that initial intuitive idea that most people have. It's that, it's this consistent feeling of pleasantness that's common to all the different things that we enjoy. And this wasn't just some casual idea. The encyclopedia reminds us that this simple picture was really, really influential, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries across psychology, economics, and of course philosophy. And it was very closely linked to hedonism.
Right, hedonism. And the encyclopedia points out that the hedonists, they really took this simple picture and ran with it. They argued that pleasure and pain, they weren't just, a good and bad thing, but they were the only things that ultimately mattered. They were the only things that actually make something good or bad. They said those are the ultimate goals of all our actions and the only ones that are really justified. I mean, those are some pretty strong claims.
Yeah, for sure. So if you think about it from a strict hedonistic perspective, you could argue that all values, all reasons for acting, all motivations, they all boil down to seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. It's an elegant view, but ultimately, as we'll see, it doesn't really fully account for all of the complexities of human experience.
But as is so often the case in philosophy, the simple answers rarely hold up, for very long. And in the 20th century, I mean, it really brought a lot of rethinking on this idea, the simple idea of pleasure, right?
Absolutely. Philosophers started to really question whether pleasure really was this single, simple, unified feeling. And the encyclopedia actually highlights several really key challenges to this idea. There's Gilbert Ryle, for example, taking a kind of behaviorist approach. He argued that pleasure actually wasn't a conscious experience at all. Instead, he said that it had more to do with activities, the way we perform activities and our kind of natural dispositions.
So less about what you're feeling inside and more about the way you're interacting with the world. So if you're really like engaged and focused on something you're naturally inclined to do, that's where the pleasure comes from. Is that kind of what he's saying?
Yeah, that's the basic idea. So the pleasure is about the way we do things, the way we perform actions, and that it's tied to our inherent tendencies. And then you have Henry Sidgwick, and he did a lot of introspection. He really looked into his own experiences, and what's really interesting is that he couldn't find a consistent felt quality that was present in all of his experiences of pleasure. He couldn't find that one single feeling. So this led him to propose a different way of thinking about it. Maybe pleasure isn't about a specific feeling. Maybe it's more about its inherent desirability.
Yeah.
The fact that we naturally want it, the fact that it seems like something that is good to want. So for Sidgwick, pleasure isn't so much a feeling, it's more like a kind of built-in, I don't know, wantability.
Yeah. Right. That's a subtle but really important shift in how we're thinking about it. We're moving away from the feeling, the subjective feeling to a more I don't know, more objective idea, this idea of wanting. And then, the encyclopedia also talks about Elizabeth Anscombe, who really brought the focus back to a really basic question, what is
Correct.
pleasure? Not is it good, not how does it relate to our actions, but what is it in itself?
Exactly. She was urging philosophers to really look closely at the very nature of pleasure itself,
Mm.
rather than just accepting this simple idea that was already out there. So all these challenges, they were really important in setting the stage for more sophisticated and more complex understandings of what pleasure might actually be.
Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia also talks about the idea of pleasure as a feature of momentary experience. This seems like it's still talking about pleasure as something that you experience, in a particular moment, but it adds some nuance.
Right.
It gets a little more complicated.
Right. The encyclopedia says that we often associate pleasure with things like cheerfulness or just being in a good mood. And those things, they might not be really strong sensations. They might not be like fireworks going off, but they're definitely forms of pleasure. And they can build up over time and have a big impact on our overall, emotional well-being. It's easy to not notice those subtle kind of background forms of pleasantness.
Right. It's not always about like the big dramatic experiences, right? It's sometimes about the little quiet moments, the subtle feeling of being content that makes a real difference. But the encyclopedia also makes this interesting point about why pleasure doesn't quite fit into the standard categories of sensation.
Right. And one of the things that's really interesting here is that the pleasantness of a sensation, it can change, even if the sensation itself stays basically the same. Think about like the taste of something sweet. If you've just eaten a big meal, that sweetness might not be so pleasurable anymore. You might not even like it, but the taste itself, the actual thing you're tasting, that hasn't changed. So our state of being, whether we're hungry or full, whether we're in a good mood or a bad mood, the context, all of those things can change how much pleasure we get from a sensation. It's like the pleasure isn't really truly part of the sensation itself.
Yeah, like how a hug or a touch can be so nice when you're feeling, safe and loved, but the exact same touch, it can feel bad or even scary in a different situation or from a different person. So the feeling of pleasure, it's not just automatically tied to the physical thing you're sensing.
Exactly. And this distinction between the sensation itself and our reaction to it, that's really, really important if we want to understand, the complexities of pleasure. The encyclopedia mentions Locke. And Locke talked about this idea of pleasure and pain being these simple ideas that we learn from experience. And he said they're separate from any of the senses that come along with them. And that aligns really well with the idea that our emotional feeling, it's something more than just the raw information from our senses. And then, of course, there have been many, many attempts, both in history and in modern science, to try and find a physical basis for pleasure. The ancient materialists talked about smooth stimulation. And today, neuroscientists focus on short-term brain activity.
Right.
Right. And that kind of brings us to a central challenge for any philosopher who's trying to understand pleasure. If it's not just one simple feeling, then how do we explain why we call all these totally different things pleasure? A hot bath, a conversation with friends, a piece of art. What do they all have in common? That's the question, right?
Right, and that's where things get really, really interesting for philosophy. The encyclopedia, it looks at this question head on, and it mentions Plato's Socrates and his skepticism about whether you can really generalize about pleasure, given that different people enjoy such wildly different things. But it also lays out some of the classic attempts to find that underlying unity, like, what is the one thing that makes them all pleasure? Like Plato's idea that pleasure is like a kind of awareness that your condition is improving, that things are getting better. I mean, that's an interesting idea, especially for someone with a philosophical mindset. So whether it's your physical needs being met or you suddenly understanding something new, the pleasure comes from that feeling that things are moving in a positive direction.
Right. That's the basic idea, and his idea of condition is pretty broad. It includes not just physical stuff, but also your knowledge, your social standing, all of those things. And in Plato's refined view, the pleasure is actually the sensation or the perception of returning to a kind of natural, healthy state, from a state of lacking something. And you might not even be aware of that lack. He even suggests that pure pleasures, like the pleasure of knowing or the pleasure of perceiving, those might be signs that some unconscious needs are being fulfilled. So for Plato, pleasure isn't the end goal. It's more like a sign that things are changing for the better.
So like that feeling of satisfaction you get when you finally figure out a difficult concept. Maybe Plato would say that pleasure is connected to satisfying an unconscious need for understanding.
Exactly. And this framework allows for both a kind of unity. It's all about this awareness of returning to a good state, but it also allows for a lot of diversity because the underlying needs that are being met, those can be, very, very different. But it's interesting to note that Plato also believed that the ideal life, the divine life, a life of perfect knowledge, that life would actually have no pleasure in it because there would be no deficiencies to overcome. And he said that for us, as humans, our goal should be to get as close to that state as possible.
I mean, that's a pretty wild idea, right? I mean, to think of the best possible existence as a state without pleasure. That's definitely something to think about. And the encyclopedia, it mentions other philosophers like Descartes, Spinoza, Kant, who had similar, improvement indicator views. It seems like this idea of pleasure as a sign of getting better, it's been pretty influential.
Yeah, for sure. It's a really interesting way to think about why we seek out pleasure in so many different activities. Maybe they're all ways of signifying that our overall state is getting better in some way. And then, of course, we have Aristotle, and he gives us a really different perspective. And his view is very closely connected to his idea of teleology. His idea that all living things have a purpose, a goal.
Right. Right. Everything in nature has a function of an end goal.
Yeah.
So where does pleasure fit into Aristotle's worldview?
So for Aristotle, pleasure is something that just naturally arises when we're using our capacities to the fullest and without any obstacles. Every activity, when it's working perfectly, it creates its own unique pleasure. So the pleasure of seeing is different from the pleasure of thinking, and so on. And what unites them is not, a single feeling, but the fact that they're all tied to our abilities, our fully developed abilities being used, flawlessly. So for Aristotle, pleasure isn't just a signal; it's part of what it means to live well, to flourish.
So pleasure is like the built-in satisfaction of doing something well, like a natural result of our abilities working the way they're supposed to.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And Aristotle believed that these different pleasures, they influence us in different ways. The pleasure of studying motivates us to keep studying, but it might also, make us less likely to want to go out and socialize. He saw pleasure as reflecting how well we're living our lives, with the highest pleasures being connected to our highest capacities. And for humans, he said, that highest capacity is our ability to reason, to think.
And of course, as a philosopher, he had his own ideas about the different types of pleasures that people go after, and he believes that trivial or base pleasures, those were more likely to be sought out by people who hadn't really developed their potential for those higher, more virtuous activities.
Right. He thought there was a hierarchy of pleasures, just like there's a hierarchy of our capacities. And he said that the most fulfilling and the most pleasant life is one that's dedicated to using our reason, to thinking, to contemplation. And he even compared that to the kind of the purely intellectual activity of God.
So both Plato and Aristotle, they tie pleasure very closely to the idea of living a good life, but they have very different explanations for how they're connected and for what pleasure actually is. But these classical views, they haven't gone unchallenged, right?
Oh no, not at all. The encyclopedia points out a number of key objections. You have John Stuart Mill, and while he agreed with Aristotle about this idea of higher and lower pleasures, he disagreed with Aristotle's linking of pleasure to objective functional standards.
Yeah.
Mill famously gave the example of unpleasant but very accurate smells.
Yeah.
Just because your sense of smell is working perfectly and you're perceiving the smell accurately, that doesn't necessarily mean that the experience is going to be pleasurable.
Right. Right. Just because something's working right doesn't mean it's going to feel good. And as the encyclopedia points out, this criticism goes both ways. We can experience pleasure even when nothing's really improving, like just relaxing and doing nothing.
Exactly. There doesn't seem to be any one objective condition that always leads to pleasure and that has to be present for pleasure to exist. And if we try to define what's excellent by what we find pleasurable, then we run into a circular argument.
Yeah.
So while these classical accounts are helpful, that give us a framework for thinking about pleasure, they do run into some problems when we look at the real world, when we look at our own experiences.
Okay, so this brings us to another important way of thinking about pleasure as something that is directed at something, at an object or content. This is the idea of intentionality. So can you kind of break that down for us, for our philosophically minded listeners?
Sure. So many of our mental states, things
Mhm.
like believing or desiring, they're about something. They have an object. And the idea here is that maybe the unity of pleasure, it doesn't come from a common feeling, but rather from this directedness. Pleasure is always directed at something, even if those somethings are very different. So instead of looking for one single feeling, we focus on the fact that pleasure is always about something, whether it's an activity, a person, a thought, or even a possibility.
So the experience of pleasure, it's not just like a free-floating feeling. It's always connected to something specific.
That's the idea.
Huh.
The encyclopedia mentions, a tradition within Christian philosophy that connects pleasure to acts of willing or loving. And those are directed at something. And then it talks about Fred Feldman's view,
Mhm.
which is that pleasure itself is a kind of propositional attitude, like believing or desiring. But it's directed at different things, different propositions. You can think of a propositional attitude as like a mental stance that you take towards a statement.
Yeah.
So for Feldman, pleasure is like a specific kind of yes that you mentally give to something you're experiencing.
So all pleasures are basically us taking a yes stance towards some statement. So the pleasure of eating a piece of chocolate might be, like I am tasting this delicious chocolate, and we're taking a positive attitude towards that statement.
Yeah, that's a very simplified example, but you've got the basic idea. Feldman says that the attitude itself, that's what makes all pleasures alike, while the specific content, the actual statement, that's what explains why we enjoy so many different things.
Yeah.
But this view, it has its own challenges. One big question is whether there are pleasant moods that don't seem to be directed at anything specific,
Yeah.
like a general feeling of well-being. How do you connect that to a specific statement?
That's a great point. It's hard to say what statement a feeling of contentment is a yes to, right? And the encyclopedia also brings up, the question of young children and animals. Do they really have these complex thought processes in order to feel pleasure? I mean, that doesn't seem quite right.
Right. If pleasure is always a propositional attitude, that seems to imply that you need a pretty high level of cognitive ability.
Yeah.
And it's hard to believe that babies and animals have that. So some philosophers have looked for other kinds of attitudinal accounts that maybe aren't so demanding.
Like the simple idea that pleasure is just what we like. I mean, it seems obvious, right? But the encyclopedia points out that even that word liking can be kind of tricky.
Yeah, that's right. Liking can definitely refer to a pleasurable feeling, something separate from wanting. But it can also mean something more cognitive, like desiring. So the word itself can be a little slippery. And the encyclopedia also talks about Brentano, who really focused on the idea of intentionality in consciousness. And he said that pleasure involves a kind of loving. And it's directed at our sensory experiences or the content of our thoughts. And this idea actually has roots in medieval philosophy, in scholasticism, where they really emphasize this idea of intentionality.
So Brentano's view is that when we feel pleasure from our senses, we're essentially loving the act of sensing. That's a very elegant way of putting it for a philosophical audience.
It is, and it shows that philosophers have been thinking about pleasure through this lens of intentionality for a very long time. But the encyclopedia also cautions us about just taking these medieval ideas and plopping them into modern philosophy without acknowledging that
Yes.
the underlying assumptions might be very different.
So let's go back to Feldman's specific attitudinal approach. The idea that pleasure is this uniform propositional attitude. It's like a belief. And the encyclopedia lays out some pretty strong criticisms of this view.
Right. Yeah, definitely. One problem is that it's hard to see how this idea fits with those quiet pleasures, like taking a nap or daydreaming or just, feeling good for no particular reason. Does it really feel like we're actively thinking a thought making a statement in those moments, it doesn't quite fit. And as we talked about before, saying that babies and animals need to have, full-blown thoughts and self-awareness to feel pleasure, that just doesn't seem right. It feels like we're forcing a complex cognitive structure onto something that might be much, much simpler. And the encyclopedia makes this really good point that this might be a false choice, this choice between feeling and intentionality. Why does it have to be one or the other?
Exactly. It's like we're trying to make it more complicated than it needs to be. Why can't it be both?
Right, right. And some philosophers, they do argue that pleasure is both. It's both a feeling and it has this directedness. And Anscombe, she offers a different way of looking at it. She says that the differences between different types of pleasure, they come from the different activities that we do and enjoy. So the pleasure of, riding a bike is different from the pleasure of thinking about riding a bike, because they're just different activities. And in this way, we don't have to say that even simple creatures need to have, these really complex thought processes to feel pleasure.
That seems to make more sense, like it's more grounded in reality. Pleasure isn't this abstract attitude. It's tied to the specific things that we're doing and experiencing. And the encyclopedia even suggests that the most natural way of thinking about this attitudinal view is like a neo-Aristotelian adverbial view, where pleasure isn't a separate thing. It's more about the way we experience the activity itself. We enjoy sensing a sensation or thinking a thought.
Right. It's not a separate attitude directed at an object. It's the quality of the experience itself.
Yeah.
And then the encyclopedia goes on to talk about some of the finer points of Feldman's view, especially about propositions that aren't actually true or even possible, and whether those can be objects of pleasure, which raises some really interesting questions about the nature of reality, and it highlights a key difference between pleasure and belief. Pleasure seems to be much more connected to our biology, to our emotions. It's not as closely tied to how our minds work in a broader sense. Right. Which brings us to these welcoming views, the idea that pleasure might be a kind of welcoming attitude towards experience, or even a more general kind of welcoming orientation towards the world. Right. These views try to capture the idea that pleasure is basically a positive way of relating to our experiences.
Yeah.
And these welcoming whatever comes views are kind of similar to some ideas in biology and psychology that connect pleasure with moving towards things, with approaching things. And it also fits with the common sense idea that pleasure and desire are connected. And it could even explain those non-intentional pleasant moods. Maybe pleasure at its core is just a part of this welcoming stance that we take towards the world.
Now we can't talk about pleasure, especially for a philosophical audience, without talking about motivation, right? About what drives us. It seems so obvious that we want pleasure and we want to avoid pain, but the encyclopedia says that this relationship might be a little more complicated than it seems at first.
Yeah, definitely. While pleasure can be a really strong motivator, the encyclopedia points out that you can actually separate pleasure from motivation if you look closely enough. And neuroscientists, they're trying to understand what they call true pleasure, something beyond just cravings and maybe false rewards. And this suggests that the connection between pleasure and what really drives us to do things, that might not be so simple. Think about addiction, for example. In addiction, the wanting, the craving, it can be totally separated from actually liking something.
So not everything we're really driven to do actually gives us pleasure, and not everything we enjoy makes us, really, really want it. And addiction is a perfect example of that, right?
Exactly. The encyclopedia looks at these motivation-based analyses of pleasure, and it talks about the problems with them. It highlights the view that there are many different things that motivate us. And this view was held by, Plato, Aristotle, and just, common sense. They say that pleasure is just one of the things that motivates us. There are other things like wanting honor or wanting revenge. Hedonists argue that babies seek out pleasure, and they say this shows that pleasure is the ultimate goal. But the Stoics, they disagree. They say that pleasure is often just a side effect, a byproduct of getting things that we need for survival. And they say these things are driven by instinct, by nature.
So the question is, are we Are we really after pleasure itself? Or are we after things that just happen to be pleasurable because of, how we're wired, how our bodies work? And
Yeah.
the encyclopedia mentions Joseph Butler, and he kind of brought back this Stoic view. He said that you can't really try to get pleasure without already having some kind of desire, some kind of motive.
Right. Butler said that you can't just decide to feel pleasure. You have to have a reason. So even things that look altruistic, like helping others, those things can lead to pleasure because they might be satisfying a desire to be helpful. But then the encyclopedia gives us examples of surprise pleasure, like when you see a beautiful sunset or you hear a piece of music that really moves you and you weren't looking for that, you weren't expecting it. And those experiences, they don't really fit with the idea that pleasure always comes from satisfying a desire.
Right, right. It's like you just stumble upon something wonderful. And the encyclopedia talks about all these different attempts to define pleasure in terms of satisfying desires. And it points out all the problems with those attempts. What about desires that you don't have anymore? What about desires that you have right now? What about just believing that your desires are being met? None of those seem to really capture what pleasure is all about.
And one of the really interesting points is that we can get confused between feeling satisfied and our desires actually being satisfied.
Yeah.
You can feel satisfied even if you haven't really gotten what you wanted, and on the other hand, you can get what you want and not feel any pleasure from it. And the modified version of Plato's itch example that really shows this, scratching an itch, it satisfies a desire. But the feeling itself isn't necessarily pleasurable. And there's research in social psychology that shows that how happy we feel, that's actually separate from whether we believe we're achieving our long-term goals.
So it seems like trying to reduce pleasure to just motivation or satisfying desires, that just doesn't work. It doesn't match up with our experience. And the encyclopedia talks about Sidgwick, and he rejected these relational accounts of pleasure, the ones based on seeking or motivation. And he pointed out that sometimes, you can get really, really excited about something and that drives you, but the actual pleasure you experience, it might not be that much.
Exactly. You can be super motivated, but the pleasure might not match that level of motivation. And this makes it even harder to say that pleasure and motivation are just, the same thing.
And all of this seems to lead us to this final section that the encyclopedia talks about, dividing pleasure or finding true pleasure. It seems like our exploration here has shown us that there's a lot more to pleasure than we might have thought at first.
Yeah, for sure. The encyclopedia explores this ancient idea found in both Plato and early Indian thought that there are different kinds of pleasures. There are pleasures that are tied to craving, to wanting something really badly, and then there are pleasures that don't come from desire or need, like feeling tranquil. And the encyclopedia mentions Adam Smith, who said that true happiness needs both tranquility and active enjoyment. And then there's Mill, who talked about excitement and tranquility as different sources of contentment. And this echoes, the ancient Hellenistic philosophers, the Epicureans and the Stoics, who really emphasize the value of calm pleasure.
So maybe those really intense pleasures, the ones that come from wanting something really badly, maybe those aren't the whole story. Maybe there's a deeper kind of pleasure, a more peaceful kind of pleasure that's more fundamental, more valuable.
Yeah, that's a question that philosophers have been asking for a long time. And the encyclopedia mentions Plato. And he is really skeptical of those pleasures that are rooted in strong desires. And Aristotle said that the calm pleasure that comes from thinking, from contemplation, that was higher than pleasures that come from achievements or from the senses. And then it talks about Lebucht, who suggests that maybe when we think about pleasure just in terms of experience, we're missing something. Maybe we need to recognize that there might be different kinds of pleasure experiences.
And that brings us to Berridge.
Yeah.
And his work in